Um, so welcome. We're just a few more folks are coming in, but I think we'll get started. So hi, everyone. My name is Bobby McDonald, and welcome to Seed and Spark. This is an ongoing expedition in which we're using nature as a model to reimagine how we learn and live together. So welcome new visitors and old friends. Welcome to grandparents, parents and children and nieces. Welcome to single and partnered people. Welcome to people of all colors, cultures, abilities, sexual expression, educational backgrounds, financial means, and political perspectives. Welcome to everyone. Whether this is your first time with us or you've been here from the beginning, we invite you to share in the leadership, responsibilities, conversations, and contributions of our community. We just want to make sure you know that you're welcome. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who is going to do land acknowledgement.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Bobby. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone. And so as we move into this acknowledgement, I just want to begin by inviting everybody to take a moment to really move into awareness of exactly where you are. Space, what room, what structure, beyond that architecture, what beings, and we'll define that really broadly. What beings, past, present, future, have inhabited, are inhabiting, will or may inhabit the spaces where we are right now. For me, I'm in an art studio, which is a little bit echoey because it's new. And it looks out onto what New Yorkers now call the Hudson River, and what Munsee Lenape people originally called the Mahicantuck, which means the river that flows both ways. The building that I'm in right now used to be a storage facility in what was once a naval shipbuilding facility built on Wallabout Bay, on land that was originally stewarded and cared for by the Munsee Lenape people. And so I want to formally uplift and celebrate the lives of these original human caretakers of this land, their creativity, their ingenuity, their traditions and discoveries, the things they found funny, the things they held sacred. And I want to acknowledge the violence of colonial settlers and federal policies that have perpetuated generations of genocide and forced migration and systemic oppression that pushed the Lenape west and north to rebuild their nations in the areas that we now call Oklahoma and Wisconsin and Ontario. I want to celebrate that there are Lenape communities that are thriving today, including Lenape people who belong to the Delaware Nation and Delaware Tribe of Indians in Oklahoma, the Stockbridge Munsee community in Wisconsin, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, Moravian of the Thames First Nation, and Delaware of Six Nations in Ontario. And I also want to acknowledge that we are right in the middle of Black History Month, and I've had opportunities in partnership with this incredible arts organization called Black Gotham, right across the river in the Seaport in Lower Manhattan, to learn some incredible stories about the impact of folks from the African diaspora on the founding and early history of New York City. Black folks who owned land, who raised families, who held leadership positions, who led rebellions in the 1600s and 1700s. And whose stories often get erased. And so I wanted to celebrate and acknowledge their contributions as well. Part of our intention for gathering tonight, a really central animating principle for Seed and Spark, which I think is in really profound alignment in beautiful ways with Sophie Strand's work, is to reimagine and live into a world where extractive, hierarchical, racist, patriarchal, and colonial approaches to science, art, philosophy, spirituality, and storytelling are surrendered, are returned to the soil to be composted, to borrow a metaphor from Sophie. We imagine a reality in which Indigenous wisdom and sovereignty is held sacred and recentered. And we ground this collective act of imagining, not only with solemnity of purpose and reverence, but also with a lightness of spirit and a playful imagination, an abundance of pleasure, and an unabashed calling in of joy. So with that spirit, I want to welcome each of you. I want to encourage you, if you would like to offer your own land acknowledgement, either in the chat or if you'd like to unmute, you may do that. And then we'll move forward in that spirit of joy to our musical offering for this evening. And I'll toss it back to Bobby.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to introduce Rachel Milan, and just maintaining that same beautiful awareness and level of detail and depth that you just took us to, Kate, to help us be present. You are going to enjoy hearing the voice of Rachel Milan tonight. And I know Rachel personally, and I've benefited from many opportunities to hear her sing. And the voice that you're going to hear, you decide, but for me, it comes from somewhere in her heart, and there's something about the look in her eye. It's just, you can really hear it. But Rachel, to give her other intro, is also just a singer-songwriter from Chicago, and she loves snails, being in the woods, hanging out with her children, and singing in community. She leads music in Jewish settings for people of all ages, teaches adult child group classes, and often sings out loud when she's walking alone on the sidewalk. She recently learned all the words to the Encanto soundtrack. She's got a 3-year-old at home. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I had a chance to kind of look through some of Sophie's work, which I hadn't encountered before, and was so beautiful. And I watched a YouTube video, Sophie, of you talking a little bit, and it reminded me of this song that I love by actually a Bay Area singer-songwriter named Danny Saucedo. So this isn't a song that I wrote, but something I want to bring to this group that I think really fits kind of the conversations you've been having. The song is called "The Process Whereby Nitrogen is Returned to the Soil." And maybe this group does know, I didn't know until I heard this song, but in order to have fruitful and happy crops, you need a lot of nitrogen in your soil. And one way to do that is by planting beans and letting them, do their work and erode, disintegrate. You know better than me the word that I need. And to sort of make the ground fertile that way. But another way that it can happen is by a lightning strike to the soil. And so places that are very rainy can have really nitrogen-rich soil. And this song is about falling in love again after you've been hurt. In the 7th year, I let my fields grow fallow, just like the Torah told me to. But my zeal became fear of a shallow grave for my poor old youth. Because I need nitrogen and I don't want to wait for that slow-working medicine of bacteria and legumes to take. Yeah, I need lightning, thunderclap and recoil. I need lightning to replenish the soil. By the 8th year, my fields were ready for a new rotation of crops. The dry, damaged dirt had healed over, now able to accept water drops. But I still needed nitrogen, and I don't want to wait for that slow-working medicine of bacteria and legumes to take. Yeah, I need lightning, a thunderclap and recoil. I need lightning to replenish the soil. There was a drought, and my fields felt the sun's rays every morning and every night. Coyotes ate at the saplings, and I was too tired to fight. And it was disheartening, a harvest without a yield, till I could bring myself to till the field. Yes, I took oxygen right out of your lungs, 'cause it was evident there was farming to be done. So I'll say good night again, 'cause it's getting late, and it takes time for elements to fall right into place. The sky is brightening with a crackle and hiss, and I see lightning every time we kiss. Thank you.
That was just beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And
Thank you for having me.
yeah, go feed that little baby that's waiting for you.
See you all soon.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
That was lovely.
Make sure you check out the chat before you go, because folks were noticing, all right? And I
Thank
will
you
turn it,
again.
yeah, I will turn it over to you, Kate. Thank you.
I've got that like cheeks hurting a little bit from smiling so much feeling. I love that. So a lot of you know one of the generators of Seed and Spark, Sam Shaltain, is often here hosting. He really wanted to be here tonight. He's not able to be here. We hope that he'll join us at the top of the hour. But in the meantime, I thought we could introduce Sophie using the words that Sam pieced together really beautifully in his newsletter this week to share that Sophie was coming to speak with us. I thought that they captured her essence pretty brilliantly. So he said that Sophie Strand is more a poem than a person, a magical, mycelial, meandering spirit of Gaia. She's a self-described compost heap and a neo-troubadour animist with a propensity to spin yarns that inevitably turn into love stories. She's the author of the forthcoming book, The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, which has an exquisitely intricate subtitle that I will invite her to share with you. And because Sam is Sam, he also wrote a poem, or crafted a kind of kaleidoscopic poem to Sophie using her words, because he said, you know, this is how we change the story. Very Sam. Here's an excerpt. She says, and he pieces together, there is no need of special instruction or initiation. All you need is your hands, your eyes, and the constant infinity loop drawn between your lungs and the churning, sporulated air of the entire world. We don't need any more human teachers. We need to engage in an active, humble mentorship with the more than human world. To step into liminality, to eat the sun, to place you in the fertile realm of blended bothness, to live interstitially inside the intelligence of relationships. The way out of a monolithic story is by asking for another story. To enter life, be food. And I loved that he chose that as the last line of his poem to and by Sophie, because Sophie, my experience of your work has been so nourishing.
That last line is not me, actually. It's Linda Hogan. So
Oh,
if you want to
it.
just want to acknowledge that that poem is by that sentence is by one of my favorite poets. So it doesn't even belong to me.
And one of mine. I love that. So we've got a real multiplicity of voices here, at least 4 in the mix, and now many more with everyone here to join us. But that last line really, really resonated with me in the spirit of your work, because I have come across it many different ways, and often at a moment where I really felt hungry. And your work has fed me and nourished me in very, very profound ways. And my experience of sharing your work has also had the quality of like discovering a delicious new favorite snack and like racing to want to, let a beloved taste it, like, oh, you have to try this, and then the response back of like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that I needed that, but that is so delicious. Thank you. So I want to reflect back to you that people are hungry for what you are putting on the table, my friend. Thank you for your offering, for your generosity, for the abundance with which you share your work. And I'm so glad that we get a chance to share some time to break some, not quite bread, but let's say metaphorical bread with you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that deeply generous introduction, Kate. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to reflect back a little bit on this time last year, where I had received 27 rejections for my novel, had despaired in ever sharing work again, and just feel now woven into this community of people who've read my work and have connected me back into the ecosystem of mycorrhizal nourishment in the soil. So just reflecting on a very strange year, and this time last year, I'm deeply thankful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for that moment of, softness, vulnerability. I think anyone who is doing creative work in the world, I was reflecting on this with the 8th graders that I teach. I work with adolescents, and it's always a joy to be with them in that very deeply awkward moment of their lives, as they're, sort of leaving childhood behind, sort of stepping into adulthood, and doing that in this really kind of strange charged time. We were working on a project, and I said, listen, we were doing some block printing. I said, listen, this is a little bit messy, it's a little bit dangerous, and it can be a little bit frustrating and can make you feel really vulnerable. But if you practice that doing these block prints, you're going to have everything you need to know to like do work in the world. And so what you're describing really resonates. I think anyone who's doing creative work, doing change-making work, doing community work comes up against those moments. And so thank you for moving through that difficult period and continuing to share your work. So I thought maybe we would start out with your question that you chose to kind of frame the evening. I've been sort of deep diving into your work, and so I feel like I'm quite immersed in this conversation about ecological storytelling, but that was your choice of question to frame tonight. And so I wonder if you would just walk us through what that means to you. What is ecological storytelling?
Well, ecological storytelling is anything that moves. Life happens through thermodynamic gradients. Anywhere there's a gradient of difference, there's movement. And anywhere there's movement, there's something being told, there's something happening. And we're very wedded to this linear progression that is a very anthropocentric idea of how narratives happen, that a hero goes on a hero's journey. What if a journey goes on a hero? What if there are 10 heroes living inside of a hero? And I think that ecological storytelling is just a little bit of a facile way of saying everything is a story. And that our very impoverished colonial narrative is not necessarily driving us to a destination we want to arrive at. So it might be a good time to step to the side. One of my favorite ecological stories is the genesis of our very cells, the molecular meshwork that makes us, which is symbiogenesis. Two prokaryotes, these original simple cells, fused together. They stepped through the side door into another being's body and became intimate strangers in each other's own cellular makeup. And that's what made our cells, an anarchic act of lovemaking. And so I think it's important to start, there's this idea, there's this injunction in material reductionist science against anthropocentrism and projecting human qualities onto beings. But I oftentimes think that this is a bad paint job for trying to ignore indigenous epistemologies. And the truth is that across cultures, it's considered deeply important to at least exercise the muscle of trying to empathically and imaginatively inhabit another being's experience, even if it necessarily fails. So I think ecological storytelling is about failure. It's about risking not understanding another being, but asking it, saying, oh, is your answer going to come as a feeling in my body? Is it gonna come as something I'm not expecting? Can I begin to inhabit my full body as a receptive organ for more than human stories? So, yeah.
I love that. I love that. And that reminds me of it reminds me of some writing that you've done around this notion of uncertainty, and framing uncertainty as something very fertile and very rich, and generous, really, and particularly in how that connects to illness and healing. I've been thinking a lot about healing, because we are living right now in a time of acute illness, that, very, very specific illness, as a global community, but also more broadly at a time of human disease and certainly, climate destruction and real degradation of our planet. So I wonder if you'd speak to that a little bit, uncertainty and healing and how those weave together.
Yeah, I think that embodiment is a human birthright, and so is discomfort. And the truth is that eco-awakening has been packaged and greenwashed as this kind of pleasurable ecodelic experience whereby you experience your tree as being alive. But the truth is, given how much ecocidal damage we've done, if you come back into your extended body, your extended ecosystem, you're probably going to be screaming. It's like when your foot has been asleep and it prickles back awake, it's going to really, really hurt. And so I think healing is actually about dealing with that discomfort and those different moments of waking up to the pain we've inflicted. Every arrow we shoot at the environment has a habit of coming back and lodging in our own breast. And so I think actually the moment I'm trying to doula people through is this moment not of pleasurably waking up to the animist aliveness of the world, but to that moment of discomfort when your body starts to register like a canary in a coal mine, the toxicity we've produced. And I think that as someone who has a genetic illness and as a survivor of trauma, I think that disabled people, survivors, neurodivergent people act as interesting instruments for picking up this stuff before other people do. And we can problematize illness, or we can also say that sometimes that's giving us information. We can hold the bothness. And I think uncertainty is, it's the basis of quantum physics. It's also the basis of science, which, in an age of scientism and scientific orthodoxy, has kind of been forgotten that science isn't a belief system, it's a tool. And it's a tool for constantly double checking and knowing that you're probably wrong. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that. So I think that we're threaded through with uncertainty. We're mostly dark matter. So, people struggle for answers when there's a lot of pain going on. So when you reach that ecological agony, you want a flotation device. But the truth is that the flotation device is it's gonna deflate, and then you're still gonna be in the middle of the sea. So you're gonna have to learn how to swim without knowing. And the one really great thing about that is, at least in my own life, what I author for myself is often impoverished and limited by my own beliefs about what is possible. And when you suddenly let go of those beliefs, something much bigger and more interesting can happen. This is a moment for us to realize that uncertainty gestates bigger possibilities, more collaboration, the unexpected.
I love that.
No, I just put it there because I didn't want to throw it
I
away.
think, somebody may not be muted. What you're saying reminds me a lot about Octavia Butler's writing in Parable of the Sower. And she says, all that you change changes you. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And I sit with that often and come back to that often and share it often with young people, which is really interesting to kind of explore that with them. It's quite a painful and tricky thing to hold on to, as you said, right? In these moments of deep discomfort where we just want to grasp onto something that's going to hold us solid, right? And yet when we melt into that and start to recognize that truly what keeps us safe is staying in motion and staying within the cycle, right? And that so much of, what we think of as health, how we frame either healthy bodies or healthy societies, it's like a destination to get to. Like we just check off all of these things on our checklist, then we'll just arrive at this like health place or health moment or equilibrium that'll just like hold still. And yet my experience and the experience of a lot of the people that I know in my circles is that actually healthiness is about staying in motion and staying on that cycle, right?
Yeah, anything that's too still is dead. And it's so interesting. I've been reading a lot about the whole idea of homeostasis and how it's actually created by constant perturbations. And any idea of solidity is actually like an incredibly, on a subparticulate level, is deeply agitated. And that the illusion of solidity is created by constant perturbation. So that's been a helpful reframe for me, that it's these, that in order to even maintain a self, that's kind of this morphodynamic organization, matter has to be constantly flowing through you and reconstituting you. Yeah.
Hello.
One of the things I appreciate
Good,
so
thank
much
you.
about your work, Sophie, is the way that you deep dive in such a, and I hope I'll say this in a way that
No, it's my
you'll
second
take as
time
I
here.
intend.
I'm
I would
having
like
trouble
the
hearing you.
smoked brisket
I think we've
please.
got someone who's not quite muted. Beautiful. I was just going to give you what for me is a shout out, which is to highlight what I see as a kind of a nerdy quality of like your just unabashed delight in just geeking out on the details of the mycelial webs and quantum physics and the way that you pull that research into. I'm always a big fan of anything that transcends disciplines, that pulls art and science together, or math and music together, or philosophy and physics together. And I'm really so interested in that interstitial approach. I wonder if you'll talk a little bit, I know you've written so much about ways that you've seen connections in your understanding of fungi and how that impacts your understanding of religions and how they've morphed and changed over time in the moment that we find ourselves in now. Will you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for noting that geekiness about me.
I love it.
I'm a very enthusiastic person. I'm glad that people care about the things that I care about. Fungi, I mean, I think on a very personal level, I've always loved fungi. I got very ill dramatically at 16, and it took a very long time to get a diagnosis. And I found out that I had connective tissue disease. And fungi are the connective tissues of the soil and ecosystems. So I do think that I'm biased towards fungi. And you can kind of use fungi as, they're very malleable. You can make a metaphor out of anything with fungi. So I do acknowledge that they're problematically applicable. But I do think that right now, when we're stuck in this hegemonic monologue of individuality, of progress, of social Darwinism, of evolution, a very simplistic idea of evolution, they can queer our ideas of how stories and how relationships and how minds are supposed to happen. They have no central control system. Their mind is dispersed. And if we even relax our anthropocentric ideas about individuality, they're in symbiotic relationships with root systems of plants, with mycoheterotrophs, with bacteria that are riding them like highways. They're not even in a strictly cellular state. They're in something called supracellular state, which is that their cells are open and the nuclei pass through this filamentous fabric that inhabits the soil. So, and in case people don't know in the chat, mushrooms are just the above ground reproductive flourish of a much larger body below ground, which is called the mycelial network. And it's this very thin, one cell thick fabric that felts together and disperses information from tree to tree and receives sugars from the trees and then gives minerals back. So for me, they show us that real thinking happens relationally. It happens between different species. And what would it mean if your mind wasn't isolated inside of your own experience? What if your mind only existed when you were in relational involvement, when you were interrogative with something else. And they also teach us something about ecological context, which is a fungi doesn't have a discrete morphology. You pour it into a landscape and it takes the shape of the landscape. So it shows us that there's something very important about becoming native to where we live. And there are a lot of charismatic ecological causes right now that you can hop on a plane and go support. But it's deeply important to also get to know in a very deep, intimate way the beings that live in a 5-mile radius around your house. And so I think fungi teach us to drop from the head-centered idea of how we're supposed to relate to the world into our feet and our root systems, and realize that as we breathe in our microbiome, the pheromones of the trees and the animals around us, we are very practically being reconstituted on a molecular basis by these beings. So we should probably consider them in every decision we make.
I love that. That resonates with me so much. I've also found it really fascinating. I'm sorry that there is a little bit of an echo, so I'm leaning in and trying to speak softly. So if that makes it seem like I'm being a little bit secretive or intimate, that's why. I'm really fascinated by the questions that you've asked as well about sort of different forms of gods throughout time. We've talked about kind of earthbound gods or fungal gods versus sort of sky gods or solar gods. And I know it can get tricky when we get really wedded to those binaries, like that's its own slippery slope. But I wonder if you would share with us a little of your thinking about, just those differences and how they map onto your thinking about fungi and the plant world.
Well, in an essay that hasn't been widely published, but is one of the first essays in my book that's about to come out, it talks about destroying those binaries through spores. So fungi reproduce through spores, and there are 15 million tons in the air right now. Every time you breathe in, 10 spores. And they actually, you were talking about Rachel was talking about nitrogen fixing. So actually, fungi create weather systems. And they're finding more and more that these spores nucleate water molecules and create rainforests, pretty much, that then facilitate the humid conditions whereby fungi sporulate again through mushrooms and create those lightning strikes, which then also produce mushroom fruitings. So I'm interested in spores as this way of fusing sky gods and dirt gods. You know, I don't work by negation. I work through addition. Compost heap. It's not that we're trying to clean something, we're trying to throw enough on the pile so that something sprouts. So I'm not getting rid of sky gods or solar gods. I'm trying to think about a kind of sacred experience of looking back on these older myths and seeing the cycle rather than the linear narrative, which is the spore rises to the sky, it ascends, it becomes this storm Yahweh figure that lives inside the clouds and the sunlight, that then goes back to the ground and nourishes the ground and continues that vegetal cycle of refruit, sporulate, and then decay. And I think my theory of myth is really that we see these above ground myths, but they're really just the reproductive flourish of much deeper connective tissue in the soil. And it might be interesting to reroute some of these myths in their ecological context, their social context, and compost them with some modern ecology and science and poetry so that they could perhaps offer some help rather than ossified ideas of how we're supposed to create a narrative, cultural or personal.
Amen. Or a woman, or all of us. Yes, yes. I wonder if I can invite you, if you'd like to share some of your writing with us. I was saying to you earlier that I think as adults, we don't often get a chance to be read to. I think it's a really phenomenal pleasure, certainly a pleasure of my childhood that I miss as a grown-up. So I wonder if I can invite you to read to us for a little bit.
Sure, and first I'll ask a question, which everyone can add to the chat while I do that, which is, I start my day by summoning every being I know by name, and not by taxonomical Linnaean name, by intimate name, however it shows up, that I know in a 10-mile radius of my home. So I would love, and we're flattened into these very human-centric squares right now all together, but we're bringing a lot of beings with us into this community. So in the spirit of trying to weave us all together, if you could type into the chat one being with whom you have a pretty intimate relationship, so that we could start to create in a digital way an ecosystem. Yeah. So I'm going to add mine and say it's the blue heron. They're about to start coming back. They're not here yet, but I'm waiting for their migration back, because I live at the confluence of the Hudson and the Rondout Creek. Okay. I'm going to read a piece. It's called "The Body is an Ancestor." The locust leaves lie like golden scales across the stones. I imagine last night a honey-colored snake winding along the path parallel to the river, rubbing off the skin of the past year. A light rain frills the air hung on wind, refusing to fall, swept forever sideways as if guided by another gravity. It is almost Samhain, a time when some believe that the dead are closest, although ancestral celebrations punctuate the entire calendrical year, each tailored to different ecosystems and practices. The dead, outside of our idea of time as a linear progression, paradoxically mark the passing of time. How do we honor our ancestors? What are the rituals and the spells necessary to mark this time? I want to offer that although rituals are powerful and spells can summon the unexpected, there is no need of special instructions or initiation. All you need is your hands, your eyes, and the constant infinity loop drawn between your lungs and the churning, sporulated air of the entire world. You do not need to build an ancestor altar. You do not need to trace your bloodline back 10 generations. Ancestry isn't a lineage, it's a non-linear tangle of animacy with multiple points of entry. For me, ancestry extends beyond the human. It is rhizomatic, rooting into different species and deep time. Your body is an ancestor. Your body is an altar to your ancestors. Every one of your cells holds an ancient and anarchic love story. Around 2.7 billion years ago, free living prokaryotes melted into one another to form the mitochondria and organelles of the cells that build our bodies today. All you need to do to honor your ancestors is to roll up like a pill bug into the innate shape of safety, the fetal position. The curl of your body, then, is an altar not just to the womb that grew you, but to the retroviruses that 200 million years ago taught mammals how to develop the protein syncytin that creates the trophoblast layer of the placenta. Breathe in slowly, knowing that your breath loops you into the biome of your ecosystem. Every 7 to 10 years, your cells will have turned over, rearticulated by your inhales and exhales, your appetites and proclivity for certain flavors. If you live in a valley, chances are the ancient glacial moraine, the fossils crushed underfoot, the spores from grandmotherly honey fungi have all entered into and rebuilt the very molecular makeup of your bones, your lungs, and even your eyes. Even your lungfuls of exhaust turn you into an ancestor altar for Mesozoic ferns pressurized into fossil fuels. You are threaded through with fossils. Your microbiome is an ode to bacterial legacies you would not be able to trace with birth certificates and blood lineages. You are the ongoingness of the dead, the alembic where they are given breath again. Every decision, every idea, every poem you breathe and live is a resurrection of elements that date back to the birth of the universe itself. Today I realize that due to the miracle of metabolic recycling, it is even possible that my body somehow holds the cells of my great-great-grandmother or your great-great-grandmother, or that I am built from carbon that once intimately orchestrated the flight of a hummingbird or a pterodactyl. Your body is an ecosystem of ancestors, an outcome born not of a single human thread, but a web of relations that ripples outwards into the intimate ocean of deep time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sophie. That's one of my favorite pieces. I didn't know that you were going to read that tonight. And I'm really so glad to have been able to hear it in your voice. And it's interesting as well, sometimes the synchronicity of life astounds me, although you'd think I would be used to it by now. But I actually have a dear friend on the call who is an artist, and she and I had a conversation about one of the lines in that piece in connection with her work. And she and I have also had a lot of conversations about animism and what it means to be an animist. And I think I hadn't quite realized that that's what I am, or that that's how I see the world fully until pretty recently. And reading your work has really crystallized my understanding of that. It's interesting that that's happened for me while I'm living in the city. I'm an urban animist, if such a thing exists. And in connection to Susan's work, the friend that I just mentioned, one of the things that really strikes me about what she does is that she has this, what I think is an animistic relationship with objects that she finds as she walks through the city. And I love the idea, sometimes when I think of, or when I used to think of animism, I kind of had this purity test that to be an animist, one had to sort of like live in a yurt, you know, on a 100-acre farm or something like that, and, you know, weave your own flax and garments and things like that, in order to really truly be in touch with the spirit of the land and the spirit of the objects and the people and the places and, you know, beings around you. And my understanding has shifted so much, partly through your work and partly through Susan's, you know, really watching. She'll pick up a cement block or a pine cone or a piece of like rubber tire that's like half burnt off, you know, on the side of the road, and transforms it, you know, through her conversation with those objects into artwork. And some of the objects are natural and some are quote unquote man-made, and that distinction begins to blur when you let it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you frame animism and what it means to you to be an animist.
I believe in an animism of patchy differences and beings that prick and sting and kill and fuse. And I think that sometimes there can be a problematic homogenizing effect of animism, that everything's alive in the same way. I believe that everything is alive differently in ways that I might not understand, but I should perhaps be careful about and aware of. I also always want to problematize the idea of nature as somehow being siloed off from the urban or from the human. We are embedded in nature. Everything we make is nature. The internet is nature. One of my big animist offerings lately is I pray to the internet. It has been created by chemicals and elements that are from the earth, that are part of us. Whatever it is, whatever kind of pattern and intelligence it is in some way alive. And I should probably honor that rather than problematize it. And not to say that it's good or bad. And I think that animism can become simplified by binaristic moralities, and we shouldn't do that, because, you know, believing something alive doesn't mean that it doesn't, you know, I'm very into microbial mysticism and smalls and a microanimism, to bring up the work of Shiv Watkins. But you know, you don't want to make eye contact with certain viruses or bacteria. You can honor them without wanting to make eye contact. So for me, animism is more about realizing that every step you take implicates and resonates through the world. You know, in a very practical sense, every step you take on soil impacts like hundreds of miles of mycelial fungi. So it's an interesting way of thinking about it, that every step you take impacts and capillaries out into a vasculature of aliveness. Yeah. How is animism landing for you today? And that's a question that I extend to everyone.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from folks. Feel free to either write in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function if you'd like. I think for me, one of the really everyday kind of occurrences or embodiments of animism for me is I walk so much in the city. I kind of sometimes joke, my parents live in suburban Connecticut, and when I go out to see them, you know, people say like into the country, I get so much less contact with the weather and the air and the environment because they take cars everywhere. I'm never outside unless I like go for a walk. But in the city, I walk everywhere. I walk 4 to 6 miles a day, rain or shine. And one of the things that I love is to look for, and now I really like, I know my maps. I know exactly where exactly to look for what I feel like are my friends, which are reflections of sunlight off of windows onto other buildings, and how they create these incredible splotchy patterns. I call them glyphs because they almost look like a language to me. And they have a predictability. I know that at certain times, if the sun is out, I can find them when the light hits at particular angles and refracts back. But they're also never quite the same because the seasons shift the axis of the earth, and the weather patterns change. So I love that predictability, but also kind of uncertainty. And I've loved sharing that practice with other folks. And some of the people here on this call actually are beloveds who will often send me little photos of spottings that they've found, and it creates this little network of light. Our little phones, our photographs, zapping back and forth. And on the simplest level, it's a form of care that's really grounded in noticing and looking up, which city dwellers don't often do. So that's one small piece. I'd love to hear from other people, though.
Beautiful.
Don't be shy, friends.
I would like to know what Sophie's first and earliest memory of school and learning was. Where did she go to school? How did she learn all she knows from birth to 18? It's a complicated question.
Sorry, that doesn't address the animism, but Bobby invited people to put questions. So anyway, that's my question.
I'm happy. Should I answer or should I wait? What do you think?
I think it's a great question, and then maybe that'll give some other folks a chance to think if they'd like to share.
My parents are intellectuals and they're writers. They write about the history of spirituality. My dad ran Tricycle magazine for a while when I was growing up in the city. He was also the ex-head monk of Zen Buddhist monastery. So I was raised before I even went to school, I was raised by parents that read aloud to me, by rabbis, theologians, Theravadan Buddhist monks, Zen Buddhist monks. I was raised in an intellectual culture where, interfaith communities were coming together to discuss the koans of the Bible, like applying Zen practices to Jewish texts and Christian texts. So that's like my early memories are of being an adult culture. And I went to a public school, and it's actually been the public schools I went to have been talked about as some of the worst schools that have ever existed. The high school is like one of the most intense experiences ever, where it was like where super rich city folk who moved upstate went to school with people who never learned to read from until like our senior year of high school. And 20 people I graduated with from a class of 130 are dead of ODs. So that's an important contextual piece of information. So I'm always a self-taught learner, always an autodidact. I read hundreds of books growing up. My parents were happy to supply them. But I also experienced violent sexual trauma at the age of 2. So I would say my first education experience was that. And learning that was possible, that the unthinkable was possible, that hell can coexist with beauty, and that, like the two are not, they're entangled, that deep care and deep violence coexist in this world in a way that cannot be separated. So I would say that my education begins in hell. I've been deeply taught by hell and by underworlds, human created. I think most underworlds are created by human beings. Yeah, they don't exist after death. They exist when you are deeply alive.
Thank you so much for that really generous answer. Salamata has her hand up.
Salamata, do you want to jump in?
Salamata, do you want to share?
Yeah. Thank you so much for vulnerability and speaking about your experience. It means a lot. I know I might be a little laggy, but Already pretty awesome. Thank you for it. Oh no. Oh no. Yeah.
Salamata, I don't want to interrupt you, but
Um,
your sound is
but
really laggy.
I would like to talk about animism because I'm in an AP government class now. We're learning a lot about different cultures, and today we got to talk about communes. I'll try again later.
I would love to hear what you have to say. Do you mind trying
Just
to?
started. It just, your voice came in now. Try again.
Yeah, try again, Salamata.
I've been learning in my AP government class about different cultures. And today we were learning about communes in relation to like the communist state in China back in the 1950s to about the 80s. And I was speaking to my class of like other high school students who've grown up in the city like our entire lives and know nothing about real life. I was talking about how freeing it would be to live on a commune or in a society where we had the responsibility of taking care of each other instead of entirely relying on a government that has disappointed so many of us as people of color and queer people. And it was interesting to kind of see how many people would love that as a dream and how many people would love to work towards that, but don't find it possible, even though we are the children and we are the people of the future. That lack of hope in the high school classroom was very uncomfortable to witness. And it was nice to be here today to see that there are people who care about it and who believe in it and who have that hope for the future and for our communities.
Yeah, it gives me hope too. Thank you, Salamata. I also, as someone who wants to have children, if that ever becomes a possibility, I can't imagine I see people having children outside of community, even if they're technically in community, and it's really, really hard. And I see a lot of young mothers right now really, really struggling, and I can't imagine how mothering is possible without a complicated support system of elders and grandmothers and animal kin and community. I always think of, there's an interesting book, I have a lot of problems with it, called Sex at Dawn, but it does kind of paint a picture through an anthropological lens that of, you only become heavily dependent on one set of parents to screw you up when there's a model of having a nuclear family, but that's relatively recent. It used to be that everyone in a community mothered and fathered you. So if your mother and father were not super present, other people would be there to do the job. So I do dream of, hopefully, if someday I have children, it could be within some kind of a community where everyone's mutually child rearing. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's
Yeah.
the lens I always come at it from.
I just wanted to acknowledge that somebody in the chat just put a link to the network of over 20,000 intentional communities around the world. Salamata, for you to know that, and if it helps your classmates know that there is quite a robust network of those communities, even within the United States, of successful long-term communal living in a variety of urban and rural settings. And that resource, whoever shared that is really, it's a helpful resource to check out.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for adding your perspective, Salamata. It's really important. I had a last question, Sophia. We are getting close to the top of the hour. We'll see if there's a little space, just to stick around. But I actually did have a last question that keys into this notion of hope and also children. It's a question that occurred to me a couple of weeks ago as I was sitting with my child at the kitchen table. It was right around Martin Luther King Day, and he was memorizing a part of a speech that he had to present in class. And it was the part of one of Martin Luther King's last speeches that says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And so my son asked me what that meant. And I said, well, you've come to the right place, because this is one of my favorite pieces of language. And I started to unpack it for him and explain that it had been sort of a North Star for me. And as I was explaining it, it had been a heavy couple of weeks. It was a particularly dark news cycle. Now that I think about it, I can't even remember why, which is actually pretty indicative of where we've been these last few years and last decade, et cetera. I think it was the Voting Rights Act was being, dismantled on the eve of MLK Day. But I started to get this ache in my chest as I was speaking to him, because I realized that I was questioning as I was talking whether I actually believed that anymore. It felt like the floor was kind of falling away from me. And so I wonder, from your perspective, I'm not sure how you frame morality as it intersects with the different lenses through which you see our very kaleidoscopic and multifaceted world. But what do you think about that? The idea that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Are we moving toward a space of alignment? I know you've talked about the idea that we're being sort of doulaed through, or questioning whether we're being doulaed through this moment of trauma with the ancestors on the other side guiding us through. How do you frame that?
I'm reading a great book right now that I'll put in the chat, which is, I think, maybe one of the most brilliant books I've read in the past 10 years. It just came out. Nonfiction, poetic book by a paleontologist going back through deep time. And you lose the human in the first chapter. You're past the human narrative. Because you're going from now backwards. I don't know what moral arc he's talking about. It seems like it's a human arc, and humans haven't been around for that long. And so I question what justice is. I mean, we've had five major extinctions where 99% of life died. So that's a dominant ecological refrain, is complete extinction. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying it's bigger than me. It's and as someone who will probably die of the disease I have, I will, and it could happen tomorrow, and it will happen sooner than other people. I have to start to problematize my idea of how the story is supposed to happen. And so that's what I offer from a very personal, situated, subjective lens, is I say, how do I make my life into good soil for other beings? My favorite philosopher, Andreas Weber, who is also brilliant, and I'll put in the chat, says that how can I realize that my aliveness doesn't matter, but I should contribute to the general aliveness of the world while understanding that it could be at the expense of my own aliveness. And I think that the world does trend towards the general aliveness. So if justice is the general aliveness, I agree. But I think that human aliveness is perhaps ancillary. It's not quite as center stage as we think it is. But this can actually, especially for disabled people, for terminally ill people, be comforting. That we are still contributing, even though we're not going to make it to the final chapter. We're going to make good soil for something. So it's about wedding ourselves to other beings, so that we're married to them. We're involved in their survival, such that our survival is less problematically important. I'm not saying that I don't think we're going to survive, but I also don't think that it's perhaps the most important thing to focus on. The thing to focus on are ecosystems or relationships, rather than on one monologuing species.
Yes, I'm nodding and nodding and nodding. Yeah, that speaks to me so deeply, that night after that moment at the kitchen table, I really had sort of a dark time and sat and thought, and didn't come up with any vast pronouncements. No light shone down from the sky to, bring me to transcendental awakening or anything like that. It was a very small and simple shift, but I kind of realized that even if that were not true, if I couldn't hold on to that as my North Star anymore, that I didn't need to predicate my intimate action and my practice of being in relationship with my beloveds and moving toward what feels in my body like justice or aliveness. I don't have to have that hope. I don't have to have that that certainty that we're bending toward justice to be in right relationship with my practice. My practice is just getting up every day, feeding my people, showing up for my students, making some artwork, looking at my tree shadow and my lights on the buildings, right? And whatever else I can cook up and scheme up, and whatever other good trouble I can get myself into, right? But that maybe I could remove that need to know the outcome, or the desire to sense that I was moving in this directional way. That seemed a little less certain, but maybe that's not as important as the stepping day to day and being in the practice.
I don't have any answers for this one, and I can only imagine how much more fraught and high stakes this question is when you have kids. So I want to honor that. The position you're in is deeply entangled. So yeah,
it's tricky. It's tricky. I wonder, as I mentioned, we really are at the top of the hour, and so I want to honor folks' time. But maybe in closing, Sophie, do you have any questions that you'd like to pose to the group?
Give me a smell word. I know that's so odd, but I write a lot about the senses, and smell is most connected to memory. And so when you're creating spaces and writing, I think smell has to be the dominant scaffolding. And we have the least words for smells in the English language. So I'm always collecting smell scents. And that's another way for us to create an ecosystem. Of course, my other question for you is like, what is landing for you tonight? What is taking root? But also smell words.
I love it. So keep these smell words coming. I always come back to the smell of petrichor. That was a really electrifying moment for me when I realized that smell of the earth kind of like lighting up when it gets wet, when the rain comes, or lightning strikes. That was really exciting for me to find out that there was a word for that. And I love the soil on the forest floor, lilac, wet air.
Yeah, fresh hot tar. Yeah, like gasoline for me, non-human smells can, I mean, human pollution smells can also be evocative.
Yeah, absolutely. Musty dried willow. I love it.
Thank you everyone so much. This has been a really, really special day and time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a gift, Sophie. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for sharing your work as freely as you do, and for showing up with so much vulnerability and softness, and also with so much power. There's just a real ferocity in the way that you attack your scholarship, and the detail and the care that you bring to your theories and to your thinking, and also a real openness and an evocative spirit as well. And I love that you find that balance and that you do that dance with so much deftness, with so much care. Thank you so much. And friends, let's continue to stay connected. Sophie, where can folks find you online?
You can find me at Instagram. And Kate, thank you for your deeply agile intelligence and empathy, and for guiding us through tonight. Thank you so much.
It means so much to me. Thank you.
I'm on Instagram at Cosmogony. I have a Substack where if you want to support my work, you can. But I also offer most of my work for free. And yeah, I have my newest book is up for sale on Amazon. It'll be out next fall. It's definitely goofy. It's the most earnest, goofy thing that's ever been written, and it's like showing up to the ball in a pumpkin. Yeah, but
Sophie,
feel free.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but will you say the whole title? Because it just delights me down to my toes. Like, I just can't bear it, and I just want to hear it, please.
They made me put Rewilding the Masculine as the subtitle, which I didn't choose, but the original subtitle, which they still have on the cover, is The Flowering Wand, Lunar Kings, Lycanized Lovers, Transspecies Magicians, and Rhizomatic Harpists Heal the Masculine. So, thank you.
Amazing, amazing. Blessings. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for being here. What a lovely night. Thank you, Rachel, for your beautiful music. You can scroll up in through the chat if you didn't catch her Venmo. I invite you to do that before we all sign off. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Dan, Dave, pardon me, and Sam in spirit. Thanks to all the friends at Seed and Spark. And Sophie, again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.